nett. Das Fräulein Gerda, das Fräulein Gerda. Jeder wär froh, jeder wär stolz, wenn er sie hätt. Das Fräulein Gerda, das Fräulein Gerda. Alle Leute bleiben plötzlich stehen, um dem süßen Mädel nachzusehen. Ist sie nicht süß, ist sie nicht lieb, ist sie nicht nett? Das Fräulein Gerda, das Fräulein Gerda. Heute Abend bring ich sie nach Haus.
Es war sehr früh am Morgen. Die Straßen rein und leer. Ich ging zum Bahnhof. Als ich eine Turmuhr mit meiner Uhr verglich, sah ich, dass es schon viel später war, als ich geglaubt hatte. Ich musste mich sehr beeilen. Der Schrecken über diese Entdeckung ließ mich im Weg unsicher werden. Ich kannte mich in dieser Stadt noch nicht sehr gut aus. Glücklicherweise war ein Schutzmann in der Nähe. Ich lief zu ihm und fragte ihn atemlos nach dem Weg.
Entschuldigung, können Sie mir den Weg zum Bahnhof zeigen?
Von mir möchtest du den Weg erfahren?
Ja, da ich ihn selbst nicht finden kann.
Gib's auf. Gib's auf.
Wer kann da vielleicht noch mal eine kleine eigene Fabian? Fabian, geht es dir nicht gut?
Was? Nein, ich war wohl gerade in Gedanken.
Gut, dann fassen wir das also jetzt noch einmal zusammen.
Guten Abend, good evening, Sandhyakal Shubha Hovo, Shubha Sandhya und allerlei. May I request our director Bjorn Kettels to take over and say a few words and flag off the show.
Yeah, thank you, Jayashree. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our online event, A Conversation About Kafka, which is one of our highlights related to our regional programming around the Kafka year in 2024. And today we are celebrating 3rd of July as Franz Kafka's birthday. And on the exclusive guest list for this celebration, we have 3 close friends of Kafka with us tonight, who we have invited as panelists. That is Professor Rosy Singh, Seralathan Panneerselvam, and Dr. Milind Brahme. Very warm welcome to all of you, and thanks a lot for joining us today. Every good birthday celebration needs an appropriate present as well, and we have found a very special birthday gift that was crafted in the framework of the Diamantenschliff, the Digital Translation Academy of the Goethe-Institut South Asia. The related website of this amazing project, which will be launched today, features a special Kafka segment that includes translations and podcasts of various excerpts from Kafka's works into our key languages from South Asia. And we are very much looking forward to present this to you today. Related to Diamantenschliff, I would like to express again my gratitude towards the language mentors, translators, external experts, speakers, podcast readers, consultants, facilitators, and coordinators who contributed to the success of the Translation Academy. The comprehensive list, along with brief introductions, is part of our website that will be, as I said, introduced to you shortly. Also, big thanks to our library team here in Mumbai, Joshi and Mansi Bapat, for organizing this event and making sure that the Diamantenschliff website is ready to be presented to the public today. I know that was a lot of work, but it all happened nicely in time. And now I would like to hand over to Joshi to guide you through today's program. And what's left to me is wishing all of you an insightful and inspiring evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bjorn. I am also grateful to Amrita Dhara, my colleague, who has put together the content. She has coordinated with the regional office. She has looked at the design. She has done proofreading. She has cross-checked translations for this website along with us. Big thank you, Amrita, to you, who's sitting right across here. So now we start this event. Friends, as you remember, on 3rd of June, we remembered Franz Kafka on his 100th death anniversary. And today, 3rd July, birthday of Franz Kafka. The same Franz Kafka who said, "I never wish to be easily defined, and also I am a cage in search of a bird." And Kafka's stories mostly revolve around human experiences, as you know. We know that feeling of being lost and alone and helpless in this world at times. So all these feelings are universal and they apply to people then and now all over the world. And they are completely independent of cultural contexts or political structures. And that is why Kafka is read and understood in all continents. So let us speak about Kafka today and celebrate that eternal Kafka and that little bit of Gregor Zamza within us. And I'm very happy to introduce today's panel. All of them are my friends, Goethe-Institut's friends, Professor Rosy Singh and Dr. Milind Brahme and Panneerselvam, Seralathan. While Rosy and Milind are my contemporaries from JNU days, Seralathan is an esteemed and experienced, very dear colleague from Goethe-Institut, Chennai. So Rosy Singh is Professor of German Literature at the Center of German Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She wrote her MPhil and PhD on Kafka, I remember, 1991 and 1996 respectively. And since then, Kafka has continued to be the focus of her work. Rosie has translated Elf Söhne into Urdu as well as in Hindi. And she has spoken about influences of Franz Kafka that extend beyond literature and find resonance worldwide in visual arts, film, and architecture, and how Indian artists such as Dilip Ranade, Anurag Kashyap, Rohit Raj Mendiratta, and Zafar Anjum take inspiration from Kafka. Rosie, as I know her, has a passion for Kafka texts that are just 15 lines long. And her general areas of interest are literature, comparative studies, semiotics, translation studies. So I'm going to just mention a few interesting contributions by her. One is Kafka and mythology, transformation of myths. Secondly, Rilke, Kafka, and Manto. I'm so looking forward to this kind of an article for our website. Rosie, whenever you can give it to us. So Rilke, Kafka, Manto, semiotics of love, life, and death. And also Kafka in Indian that was published in an online handbook, Kafka Atlas, Mitteleuropa-Zentrum TU Dresden. That was in 2015. Then we have Seralathan Panneerselvam, or Sera as we call him. He has worked at the Goethe-Institut since 1997, translated several German narratives and stories into Tamil. Sera is a lover of languages, fluent in German, French, English, and of course, his mother tongue Tamil. He's teaching German at the Goethe-Institut up to 7 days a week because there are there is no extra day in a week, so all 7 days in a week. And he's heading the long distance learning program in cooperation with IGNU. So all this keeps him very busy. And as if his life isn't hectic enough, he has translated Franz Kafka's letter to the father from the original German text, Brief and then Vater, into the Tamil. And the Tamil translation is entitled, let me take a deep breath, Tandai K. Seralathan has translated German contemporary plays and poetry through various regional projects and excellency projects. He has translated among them Roland Schimmelpfennig and the poets like Orshoya Kalat, Nikolai Kobos, Ulf Stolterfort. Sarah says that he was inspired to translate later to the father for the potential of Kafka's words to make us look at the power wielded by Indian parents over their children. Seralathan is persistent in his quest for developing knowledge. He's systematic and has unconditional integrity. Welcome, Sarah. And then my very dear friend, Dr. Milind Brahme, who completed his PhD at the Center of German Study, JNU, New Delhi. It was in 1997, and comparative study of the literary work of the Marathi writer G.A. Kulkarni and Franz Kafka. Then he taught at JNU. You will find his article about G.A. Kulkarni and Franz Kafka as an opening article in the Kafka segment of Diamantenschliff. So at present, Milind is Associate Professor for German at the Humanities Department at IIT Madras, and they are a Research Ambassador for South Asia. As I know Milind, he is an accomplished translator, a true Germanist, and a scholar with high intellectual ability, but also an independent thinker and has a pronounced intellectual honesty. Now, a disclaimer, all these participants have translated Kafka and many more. Their academic achievements have been exemplary. They have books to their credit. They have presented papers at international seminars. They hold important positions at various committees. So I'm not going to go through their CV as such, but to substantiate my statement. But now I would like to invite these outstanding scholars to converse about Kafka. They will give a brief presentation one after the other, and at the end they will respond to each other. May I now request Sarah to take over and start the presentation? Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Jayashree. Thanks a lot for having me on this program. And I'm all the more happy that this conversation on Kafka is happening under the aegis of Digital Translation Academy. Translations have always been very crucial in building bridges between cultures and countries, and also widening our worldview. But especially in these days, when there is a lot of reine Kritik ohne Vernunft, crass criticism without reason, and in the times of echo chambers, translations become even more important, I feel. As early as 1939, the Tamil writer Pudumai Pittan compiled stories from different languages and translated them through English into Tamil and published them in 1939, a collection of short stories from different foreign languages. And in one of his essays, Pudumai Pittan answered this two crucial questions concerning translation. Why translation? For whom it is intended? Initially, I said translations play a very important role in widening our worldview. Pudumai Pittan answered these two questions. He said, for whom it is intended, the translation. For those rice-eating creatures brimming with pride, who believe whatever has to be said had already been said 3,000 years back on the banks of Kaveri and Ganges. This was his take on translation, which he said in 1939. And in fact, in the number of stories translated by Pudumai Pittan, there is also one by Franz Kafka. He has translated this Eine kleine Fabel, a small story involving a cat and mouse. This also finds place in the translation of Pudumai Pittan. And Kafka is well known in this part of country. There has been a number of translations of Kafka, Metamorphosis, and through English naturally, Metamorphosis, and also many of Kafka's parables have been translated into Tamil, and one direct translation from German to Tamil was their process done by Mr. Dhanush Kodi. And the latest addition to Kafka's translation is the Surawa aphorism, which came out a few months back. So there is a lot of awareness and interest in Kafka's works in this part of the country, but still the question persists. We keep asking this question, is it difficult to understand Kafka? And how to approach Kafka's works. Almost 6-7 months back, I was invited to deliver a talk on Kafka in Tamil. And after the end of this discussion, there was a question and answer session. One gentleman asked me, when told about his experience of reading Kafka, he said initially, when I first read Kafka, I wasn't able to make out head or tail of it. And then I tried it once again. It was no better. So I said, you understood Kafka very well, because Kafka's stories, Kafka's parables don't have both head or tail, because they start in the middle. So initially, when we started today's event, we watched a film which is based on a parable of Kafka. So this has been a question to me, how to approach Kafka's works. So how to gain access to Kafka's works. So I turned to support, help to one of the early readers of Kafka, Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin considers the works, all the works of, are you all able to see this?
Yes.
Yeah. So Walter Benjamin looks at Kafka's writings as parables. And he says Kafka's writings are by nature parables, but it is their mystery and their beauty that they had to become more than parables. So the first thing is how to approach. So Walter Benjamin guides us. He says you have to look them at as parables, and how to approach parables. Even there, he gives us some guidance. So he talks about the word unfolding. The word unfolding has double meaning. A bud unfolds into a blossom, but the boat which one teaches children to make by folding paper unfolds into a flat sheet of paper. The second kind of unfolding is really appropriate to the parable. It's reader's pleasure to smooth it out so that he has the meaning on the palm of his hand. Kafka's parables, however, unfold in the first sense, the way a bud turns into a blossom. That is why the effect resembles poetry. So I've learned from these how to approach Kafka's works. And some few years back, I was encouraged by the eminent historian from Chennai, Mr. A.R. Venkatachalapati, to take up the translation of Brief and Infata. Although I had read many of Kafka's works before getting involved in the translation of Brief and Infata, so I always had this question, the fear the sense of worthlessness, guilt that permeates Kafka's works, where do they come from? What is the origin of this? This question I always had in mind. But before reading Brief und den Vater, before getting involved in the translation of Brief und den Vater, I wasn't able to really understand the source of this, the fear, the sense of worthlessness, and also this guilt. But after having read and translated the Brief und den Vater for Kafka, so I was able to connect. The Brief und den Vater is a long letter written by Kafka to his father, addressed to his father, but it was never sent to his father. The father was a kind of a tyrant in his household, and Kafka felt very oppressed by him. And all his pent-up feelings, he has given expression in this Brief und den Vater. There are many places in Brief und den Vater, so that you can see in many of Kafka's works this overwhelming despotic power. For example, in the Prozess, the very first line, someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but one morning he was arrested. So where does this come from? When I was engaged in translation, I chanced upon an event that happened in Kafka's early childhood days. In early childhood days, Kafka once in the night was pestering his father to give him a glass of water. And father didn't yield to it. He was whimpering for long. It went on and went on. The father was unable to quieten the child, and he tried various means, but they didn't work out. And he just took the child from the bed and he carried him away and put him on the balcony before the closed door. And it had a very, very terrifying experience on Kafka. As he writes, it created a kind of a scar. He writes in his Brief und den Vater, he remembers this incident and writes, das für mich Selbstverständliche des Sinnlosen ums Wasserbittens und das außerordentlich Schreckliche des Hinausgetragenwerdens konnte ich meiner Natur nach niemals in die richtige Verbindung bringen. Noch nach Jahren litt ich unter der quälenden Vorstellung, dass der riesige Mann, mein Vater, die letzte Instanz, fast ohne Grund kommen und mich in der Nacht aus dem Bett auf die Pavlatsche tragen konnte und dass ich also ein solches Nichts für ihn war. So he remembers this incident. I'll just read this passage for you in English also. For years, just a minute, give me a minute. Yeah. Due to my nature, it was impossible to link these things in the right way. The senseless asking for water, which to me seemed normal, and being carried away outside, which filled me with terror. And for years, I was tormented by the thought that this giant man, my father, could almost without reason come to me in the night and lift me out of the bed and leave me on the balcony. He was my final court of appeal, and for him, I was such a nothing. And I would also like to read this part in German, in Tamil. பிரம்மாண்ட மனிதரான என் தந்தை உச்ச அதிகாரம் படைத்தவராக இரவில் தோன்றி காரணம் ஏதும் இல்லாமல் கட்டிலிலிருந்து என்னை பால்கனிக்கு தூக்கிச் சென்று விடுவார். அவரை பொறுத்தமட்டில் அத்தனை வலுவற்றவன் நான். இது போன்ற மனக்காட்சிகள் ஆண்டுகள் பல கழிந்த நிலையிலும் என்னை வதைத்து வந்தன. So this was one experience. So I was able to, after getting involved in the translation of Brief and Infarter, I was able to understand the other texts of Kafka better. So my question today is how to approach the life of an author and vis-a-vis his works. Do we have to just pass over the biographical references like footnotes, or do we have to consider them fundamental and pivotal to the understanding of the entire body of work of an author? This question even may sound little hackneyed, but I think this will help us, many of the readers, to understand the works of Kafka better. This is the question I would like to discuss with all of you, and I think that I hope to find an answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I would like to request Rosy to share her thoughts now.
Thank you, Jayashree. But I want to start by thanking Jayashree Joshi for the invitation. We were classmates in JNU, and we also shared the hostel room for some months. And so Kafka has brought us together after
so many years. Yeah.
And I would also like to welcome another person who is I see in the list of participants. I recently wrote a paper on him.
Yes.
Influence of Kafka on Dilip Ranade, and he's there. So yeah. I'm very happy he could make it. And so many of my students and colleagues are there. I can't mention all of them, but it's nice, even if it's virtual contact, it is still some contact. Yes. So I come straight to the point. I've been asked to, or I volunteered to speak on changing reception of Kafka over times. So I would start with 80s, 90s, when I started writing my thesis on Kafka. And in those days, Kafka was, in those days, academic disciplines were segregated. So Kafka was read in the domain of literature primarily. And it was only literary scholars and literary critics who would comment, who would write on Kafka. It was primarily the domain of literature. Then, so naturally, I read all the secondary literature by literary critics. The various approaches in those days were, there were so many approaches, so many positions from which one could analyze Kafka, and that was quite confusing for me also. Of course, the first approach was initiated by none other than Max Brod, the friend. We all know he was a close friend, but that doesn't mean close friends always understand their friends. You can be friends with I suppose sometimes, at least, without understanding each other. So at least where the writings of Kafka was concerned, Max Brod was quite off the mark, and it's accepted today, more or less, that Kafka cannot only be approached or read in terms of his Jewish background, although that is one aspect of him, one part of his identity, but that is not the only identity, and he's much more than just only a Jew. So that after more publications, especially in America, there started the psychoanalytical approach. Although psychoanalysis took birth in Austria in Vienna, but it was popularized by the Americans, and it is they who have always emphasized psychoanalysis as a method of literary analysis. So in terms of Kafka, they would always very often read Kafka in terms of Oedipus complex, the father-son relationship based on his unpublished letter to father. So all the psychoanalytical jargon, Oedipus complex, castration angst, and all this terminology would find its way into analysis. And this is true even today, and it's not entirely wrong. Then the third approach, I think it started in France, when with Albert Camus, with Jean-Paul Sartre, they were, in France, Kafka was seen as read as an existentialist. He was appropriated for, in terms of Camus' philosophy of the absurd. So this was also an approach which was quite popular in Europe. And then Kafka made his way back home, well, Germany, Austria, Prague, etc. And here, slowly, of course, there were two Germanys. So we had one Marxist approach. Then we had, even later on, the feminist approach was there. So all kinds of approaches have been there. And then, of course, finally, also the socio-critical approach, if I may call it that, the socio-critical, the political approach, particularly when one thinks of his novels, The Trial and Castle, which, are read very politically in the sense that they foresee or they describe the totalitarian states, the mechanism of authorities, and how power dynamics work in a society. It could be any society. It doesn't have to be only Kafka's Society of Prague of those times. It could be any society, it could be any state, anywhere in the world or nowhere in the world. So in that sense, Kafka is, from my point of view, not so much a historical writer. I would say he's more, the ahistoricity dominates in his writing. So, and that's why I always feel people from other parts of the world can relate to him, because the themes, etc., are still contemporary. Now, but like I said, many of these interpretations were also eclectic. They were a priori judging the text based on a certain ideology or identity politics, or a lot of this father-son relationship was dominating in the analysis of whichever work you took up. And sometimes these interpretations turned into caricature, but it also reflects the density, the depth of writing, that you can interpret a work of art from so many perspectives. Milan Kundera, of course, you all know, he has written a lot on Kafka, although he's not a traditional literary critic. He's not a professor, but his interpretation of Kafka is quite respected today, and he calls it Kafkology, which in his view is far off the mark, for it reduces the intrinsic worth of his writing. It does not, it's not based on specific text, but it's based on pre-notions. So that was this was the state of research in my time. Today, the scene has quietly changed, not dramatically, I would say. One point definitely focus has shifted from literature to works of art other than literature. So now we see, we research, we explore Kafka, the Kafkaesque in other works of art like visual arts, painting, films, sculpture. These are, of course, not visual arts. Okay, we could call it visual art also, but more of, what do you say, plastic art. Then performing arts on the stage, opera also, music, and even in architecture, law, music, we find influence of the Kafkaesque. Lately, there have been quite a few comics. I don't mean only graphic novels, but actually comic strips with Kafka. And last but not least, video games. The Puritans would not approve of it, gaming and Kafka, but the younger generation likes it, and so who are we to complain? So these are some of the new domains where influence of Kafka can be found, and a lot of research is going on in this area. Then, and of course, with this, the research also becomes intermedial, not just interdisciplinary, but also intermedial. Then the second point I would like to make is that, you know, there was a recent discovery of about 100 drawings of Kafka. They were discovered in a safe in the banks of Switzerland. It was quite a sensational discovery, reported in practically all newspapers of the world. And with those drawings, illustrations, or whatever you want to call them, Kafka is now also being discovered as a illustrator, and a lot of research is going on in this area as well. There has been a production of book by I've forgotten his name, Andreas Kilcher. He's brought out the book of illustrations, and it's a very beautiful book. We have it in our library in JNU. And so Kafka himself was into multimedia. So it's fair enough that we also study his influence, not just adaptations, but influence in other domains. Then another point I would like to emphasize is that it is no longer only the political Kafka that is that exists. For today, especially for the younger generation, it is discovering the romantic Kafka as well. So Kafka, if you look at TikTok, so Kafka is romantic notings, his sweet nothings to his fiancée, Felice Bauer, are quite popular, and they are being cited by the younger generation, by scholars also. So there is another Kafka also, the romantic Kafka, who comes to the office whistling, who inundates his girlfriend with letters, 2, 3 every day. And on Sundays, he complains that there's no postal service. So then he sends telegrams. So this is the other side of Kafka, which has not been explored so much, and it is now being explored. And then there is also a third Kafka. I would say this is the, what should I say? There is also an element of humor, the comic in Kafka's works, which it may be dark humor, but it is nevertheless there. There are also some slapstick scenes in his novels, especially in Trial. So that is another aspect of Kafka which is being now analyzed. So these are the three, I would say, some aspects that are being traced nowadays in Kafka research. And if you see all these events that are now connected with his 100th death centenary and all the publications, then you see that he enjoys today extraordinary popularity that was earlier only limited to lecture halls and universities. But today there is Kafka is being read by many different groups of people. Different generations are reading it in their own way. There's a Kafka in digital space, in TikTok, and hawkers in Prague, for example, they sell mugs and T-shirts and posters with Kafka. So there is a popular Kafka as well. Another point I want to make is that, of course, there's a universal, a global Kafka, European Kafka, but there is also a Kafka who transcends time and space. Every set of people, every country may have its own Kafka. The Kafka in India, Kafka in Iran, Kafka in Russia, Kafka in Timbuktu. So people relate with Kafka in their own way. And like she had mentioned in the beginning, there's one finds traces of Kafka in Indian artists also. Dilip Ranade I mentioned. Then there is Anurag Kashyap. His film No Smoking is so Kafkaesque. Then there are so many other writers and painters and whatnot who are inspired by Kafka. There's one Urdu writer. Recently, I read a paper by a student and a colleague now who is working on that aspect of influence. And last but not least, I would like to mention that there are the readers and researchers are now gradually moving away from the long narratives of Kafka, the three novels and Metamorphosis, and they are the focus is also shifting to smaller narratives, half a page, 1 page narratives, and there are hundreds of aphoristic expressions, particularly in his diaries, etc., and elsewhere. So the focus is shifting also to smaller narratives like Der plötzliche Spaziergang, the sudden walk, die Brücke, the bridge, and so many other small texts. So these are some of the new developments in Kafka research. So I think I will end here, and rest we can discuss later on in question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Yeah, you are absolutely right about these intersections. We have a game, as you mentioned, and we also have a virtual reality experience on Kafka's Verwandlung, VR actually. And also Nicholas Mahler, if you have heard, Completely Kafka, and the poster exhibition, that's also a part of Goethe-Institut's Kafka program. So many things are going to happen in the months to come. Now I invite Milind to share his thoughts as well. Milind?
Yeah, thank you, Jayashree, very much. Thank you, Jayashree, Mansi, and Amrita for putting this together. And thank you, Beyond Kettles, for inviting us to participate in this evening. I would like to begin with an anecdote, actually, if I may. While we were waiting for people to join, when we had joined early on the screen, Rosie, please don't mind, but on the screen, there was Rosie's video with her bookshelf and everything, and Rosie was not there. Her name was there, okay, Rosy Singh, and there was no Rosy Singh in the picture for a long time. So I remember Sarah talked about his how he gained access to Kafka. So
I did my PhD under the guidance of Professor Rajendra Dengre, and Raju is also there in the audience. And I want to recount this this anecdote where we were sitting in the campus outside on the street side when a small accident happened, and one boy who was riding on a bike, he hit something, fell off, and became unconscious. And this was the late 80s, early 90s. It was not all that easy to find a phone and call an ambulance and so on and so forth. And we were all there wondering what to do. And then Professor Dengle was passing by in his old Fiat car, and we stopped him and we said, could you please help us take this boy to AIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences? And we went there in that car, and we went to the emergency, and there was a help desk at the emergency with a bold lettering saying, "May I help you?" And there was nobody there. So even in that situation, I remember Professor Dengle, who was guiding my PhD on Kafka MPhil at that time. He pointed this thing to me and said, "That is Kafka." Okay, so I was reminded of this when we were watching. Rosy had gone somewhere, but the video was there, and there was no Rosy Singh. So that was my. I suddenly got something clicked as to how one approaches reading Kafka. Of course, the word absurd is very deeply connected with Kafka's writing, and the word absurd, I think, to go with Albert Camus, need not evoke negative connotations. The word absurd is something that needs to be appreciated in its depth. And when one starts reading Kafka with a certain level of interest and participation, one begins to understand the nature somewhat of the absurd. So that, with this thing, I would like to say a few words about, I remember having said to Jayashree and Manasi that I would like to talk about what it is to read Kafka today, and also about some amount of disambiguation between Kafkaesque and the Kafkan. Rosy spoke about Milan Kundera towards the end. That's a very, very Kundera's writing on Kafka, especially that essay which he wrote in I think late 80s, at the time when a lot of the Eastern world was opening up. And I think Kundera he had already left Prague and had gone to Paris, if I'm not mistaken. And he reflects upon his time in Prague, and he writes a beautiful essay on Kafka called Kafka's World, and in which he talks of the Kafkan, and he doesn't use the word Kafkaesque, which was already in vogue at that time. He doesn't use that word, and he uses rather the word Kafkan. And what I feel is there is just like I said that the notion of the absurd need not evoke negative connotations. Similarly, I think the term Kafkaesque has been somehow associated with something which is very frightening and mysterious and surreal and something beyond our comprehension. Whereas Kundera, in his essay in the Kafkan, he actually very concretely describes what reality was like for him and for some of his colleagues behind the so-called Iron Curtain. And reading Kundera's essay on Kafka was another eye-opener in the sense how to approach Kafka's writing. So if I may go into a little bit of Kundera, he says, and I quote that Kafka's enigmatic parables, dark, angst-ridden works such as The Metamorphosis, The Castle, and The Trial, have been taken up by critics of every stripe. I think we got a taste of that, a very good overview of that when Rosy spoke, that critics of every stripe have taken up Kafka's works. And to continue the quote, to Freudians, they demonstrate a thwarted Oedipal rage. To Marxists, the alienation of capitalist society. To existentialists, the loneliness and dread of man in a godless cosmos. To all sorts of religionists, the desperate search for God. And I think the nature of Kafka's writing is, I think Sarah spoke about, he quoted Walter Benjamin on Kafka's writing as parable. I would even extend that to parabolic. And the parabolic nature of Kafka's writing, a visual image of that, to my mind, is the road going up to the Schloss from the village in the Schloss. You know, it approaches the castle, but it is, whether it actually reaches the castle, whether it really, or it just skirts by, because the castle is always in a shroud. See, so parabolic in the sense that I learned, for example, to approach an approach to read Kafka would be to kind of shed our obsession with singular, clear meaning of a text. You know, with Professor Dengle's, in conversation with him, the title of my PhD we discussed, and we decided to call it Wandern ohne Ankunft. And Wandern ohne Ankunft, in the sense, I think what I meant to say was to shed the obsession with a destination and look at what you're entering, the text as you're entering it. So that was how I began to approach reading Kafka. Secondly, when the Translation Academy also, when we did, Jayashri, we did the selection of texts for translation, Kafka's text for translation. There also, I feel what I felt was we needed to, as mentioned by Rosy, we needed to look beyond the very, very frightening world that the word Kafkaesque actually evokes, and go to shed our obsession with one single meaning, and probably spend some time on the surface of the text of Kafka's writing. You know, spend some time with the language, with his syntax, how he, I mean, those interminable sentences. But the beauty is that the interminable sentences are not very difficult to follow, because Kafka's vocabulary actually is not very difficult to follow if you're reading him especially if you're reading him in German and you know German, then it's not very difficult to follow the writing, in spite of the fact that it is labyrinthine in a sense, and it is very, very at times even dense, but still. So I think to appreciate Kafka again, and that again connects the point with something that Rosy said towards the end, that people are now also paying attention to the shorter texts of Kafka, and there are so many different moods that surface in those texts when we read them. We have to also note that these are early writings of Kafka, and they need not, I mean, they kind of give the lie to the notion of Kafka being a pessimist, which again brings me back to some of the work that I did during my MPhil and PhD, which, as Jayashree mentioned, was a comparative study of Kafka and G.A. Kulkarni. And one of the findings of research, now that I'm in a technical institute, I have to talk about findings of research. So one of the findings of that research was that the notion that that writers like G.A. Kulkarni and Kafka are considered to be pessimists is itself this notion is itself conditioned by a certain idea of what optimism stands for, what the meaning of life, quote unquote, it's a big word, but stands for, etc. And if you actually look at what they're trying to do, what the way that they're themselves trying to understand what human life is all about, that then the notion of this notion of them being pessimist thinkers kind of drops off. I mean, then you can't think in binary terms of optimism and pessimism, but you look at what exactly it is that they're saying and try and understand it as best possible. So there are a few thoughts that I thought I would share. In fact, there is the last point that I would like to end on, which is also something that Rosy touched upon about the humor in Kafka's writing. And this brings me to, it is by now well known that that when Kafka in the early days in Prague, when he read from his work among circles of friends, that that there was a lot of laughter. And it is said that when he read the first draft of the first chapter of Der Prozess, that he himself laughed so much that he couldn't read after some time. So there is that humor is, even for Milind Kundera, that humor is inseparable from the notion of the Kafkan. Only one thing that Kundera says very beautifully about Kafka's humor, I would like to quote Kundera on that. And before I go to that, one last anecdote, and this anecdote is not mine, but it is recounted by Ernst Fischer, who is an Austrian critic and writer. Ernst Fischer, Austrian Marxist, and Ernst Fischer actually said that that one should not look at Kafka as an ahistorical writer, but very much historical of his. So, but that again, that if you the audience will also note that there's again a difference of opinion between what Rosy just said and what I'm quoting from Ernst Fischer. But that is the nature of the writing. It's an open text. Kafka is not prescribing solutions to the problems of humankind. He is trying to actually find out what the problem is. And hence the text is open. The text is open for the reader to participate. And there can be as many readings of Kafka as there are people who want to read Kafka seriously. So I will end on the note of the Kafkan, about the comic element of the Kafkan as described by Milind Kundera in his essay Kafka's World from 1988. It is. So he says, Kundera says, and I quote, "The comic is inseparable from the essence of the Kafkan. In the world of the Kafkan, the comic is not a counterpoint to the tragic comic, as in Shakespeare. It is not there to make the tragic more bearable by lightening the tone. It doesn't accompany the tragic, not at all. It destroys it in the egg and thus deprives the victims of the only consolation that they could hope for, the consolation to be found in the real or supposed grandeur of tragedy." Okay, that is Kundera. It brings me also to close with one of Kafka's aphorisms, which if I remember correctly, it is, there is no room for hope in this world. And then as a second thought, what comes to Kafka is, which means that there is no room for despair either. With that, I thank all of you for listening to me. And thank you, Jayashree. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you, Milind. Thanks, Sarah, Rosy, and Milind for this kind of these presentations. There are so many concepts, key concepts that are going to change our perception of Kafka. A few things that we want to refer to now, maybe Google and understand or redefine Kafkan and Kafka X, because we have only as we say, we are only das haben wir nur am Rande angetastet in our reading. So now how to deal with it in depth, that we will see. I would like to invite three of you to respond to each other. Maybe Sarah, you want to respond to Milind. Milind, you want to respond to Rosy. Rosy, you can also choose, or I mean, you can respond to the other two speakers, and then we open the floor for audience. Who wants to go first?
Thank you. Thank you, Jayashree.
Yeah.
So when I closed my presentation, I just had a question. I would like to discuss this question with Milind and Dr. Singh. So the relationship between Kafka's life and his work. So because when I've read Kafka's works even before reading Brief und den Vater, but after reading Brief und den Vater, I was able to understand the other works of other writings of Kafka even more better. So how to approach the life and the work of an author? This is a question which is often asked, but still I'd like to ask that will help many to understand writers. That's why.
Yes, please, Milind.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Shall I respond? Yeah, Sarah, one of the things that, or 2 points. One is that biographism can be very, very tricky. But at the same time, I mean, if we take the reading of a literary text as a hermeneutic exercise, then the historical context in which Kafka lived, grew up, wrote, that becomes very important. So in the sense that it is not, although Roland Barthes has already said that the author is dead, even then, even dead authors, we need to have some information about what they did. And particularly in Kafka's case, it is important. I mean, I'm not saying that, I'm not saying so much the Oedipal relation or the Oedipal problem with the father, Hermann Kafka, and himself. But I think the situation of the acculturated Jew in a place like Prague during those days, that is a very unique, not unique, I mean, there were so many of them, but that is that's something specific to writers like Kafka, I would say. Okay, so on the one hand, you are a Jew in a society where there is anti-Semitism, whether you like it or not. Then you are in Prague, which is part of the Habsburg monarchy, which is, so in that sense, it is part of a German empire, a German-speaking empire. So you get educated in German, and yet, so you are not German enough because you're a Jew, and you are not Czech enough because you are part of the German society. So this kind of a double alienation in Kafka's situation is also very important. Although, I mean, ascribing to it too much meaning would also take away from what I just said, which is to actually read the text itself on its own merit first. Okay, so there is an importance to that. I feel what you just said, that when you read the Brief und den Vater, it opened up Kafka's texts for you. That definitely, I mean, I just told you what that anecdote when that kind of was for me, that aha moment when how to approach Kafka's writing. So I think for each one of us, it is different how the text might open up. At the same time, there's a double edge to it about giving importance to the biographical details. They're important, there's no doubt about that. But then they could also turn the reading into a determinism. They could determine how what kind of meaning you ascribe to the text. Whereas the text might have infinite possibilities.
Okay. Thank you.
That is...
Rosy?
If I may add to what Milind said, he is absolutely right. I also feel Kafka's relationship with his father is, yes, it is problematic. But please tell me which son doesn't have problems with his father, and which daughter doesn't have problems with her mother. So,
or father.
And I think what we forget is Kafka also had 3 sisters. He had to deal with 3 sisters, and he was. I mean, if you read his Metamorphosis, Die Verwandlung, there is father, but there is also a sister, and the father is brutal, but the sister is even more brutal. She goes a step further than the father when she says this, we have to get rid of it. She keeps repeating it 4 or 5 times. We have to get rid of it. This is not Gregor. This thing has made our life miserable. And that is for Gregor Zamza the moment when he decides to quit. So it was not father really in that story. The father, he didn't expect anything from the father in the first place, but it is the sister's outburst which which shatters him. So there are this biographical details are find their way into stories, but they get transformed. They get there is a kind of metamorphosis happening with the biographical details also. So it's not just a complete one-to-one relationship. A lot of churning happens, and a lot of things are happening there in the process of writing. There are many equations, many combinations and permutations, and the biographical details get integrated, but they not in the way they are in reality. I feel they are. The writing is a very complex process, and I think I would not pay too much attention to his father. He had many other problematic characters in his life. I think his relationship with Max Brod was also problematic. If what did they have? I don't know. So
yeah, can I raise just one point with
yes, please
with regard
feel
to
free. You
Max
do.
Brod?
Yeah.
With regard to Max Brod, very quickly, because Rosie, I mean, you also did say that now we know that Max Brod, in his reading of Franz Kafka, was pretty much off the mark. But then off the mark is also, we have to put it in quotes, because with Kafka's reading, if you're reading Kafka sincerely, I don't think you can be ever off the mark as far as reading Kafka goes. But determining that Kafka is this was certainly not correct. But at the same time, I think we also need to be very grateful to Max Brod, because I mean, he did recognize the genius of his friend's writing, and without Max Brod, there would be no, we wouldn't have this session
This
today.
evening, yeah.
So I think one of the because and Max Brod and other Kundera talks about this in his Kafka's World, that Egon Erwin Kisch or Max Brod and other people, Franz Werfel also. In fact, Franz Werfel is supposed to have said, when Max Brod first read some excerpts of Kafka out in a circle of friends where Kafka was not present, but Max Brod was reading it, Franz Werfel is supposed to have said that nobody beyond Chechen Bodenbach will ever understand Kafka. This was in the early teens in the 20th century, 1912, 13, whenever Brod actually decided to read something that Kafka was writing out to Franz Werfel. I mean, somebody like Franz Werfel thought that beyond a 100-kilometer radius from Prague, nobody would understand Kafka. And whereas Max Brod, who is probably a lesser writer than Franz Werfel, he recognized the fact that what he had been seeing, what he had been reading in Kafka's work, had a quote-unquote universal value. And I think so that is something that I just wanted to, I mean, this entire thought process got triggered when we talked about Max Brod and his very reductive interpretation of Kafka as a Jewish writer and so on and so. But that's also because of his politics. I mean, Kafka had the Tagebuch, there's a diary entry, enough of Zionism. And he was interested in the politics of Zionism that was coming up in that time, but at some point of time, he thought it was enough. I mean, you can't go to that extent, whereas some of his friends were politically much more committed to the idea of Zionism. So Kafka also kind of went away from that and uh, went into himself, and he discovered the entire chaos that was happening outside, inside. So it is probably also that to an extent why people like Broad were impelled to 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 interpret Kafka in a certain manner, because they also had a politics that they were committed to, so to say.
Any more responses from any one of you? To Sarah or to Rosy or to Milind? From either of you?
Yeah, I had one response to Sarah's point about Kafka's stories having no head or tail. I think you told the person that they were on the right track, right? So there is also this entire story. I mean, I don't know, but there's this entire story about the fact when he was writing their process, he had already tried his hand at writing a novel with Der Verschollene, and apart from the Heitzer, he didn't get anywhere. Although it's one of the most beautiful novels, America or Der Verschollene, and so on and so forth. But he himself recognized that he can't end what he begins to write. And one of a very beautiful book on Kafka's writing is actually titled Die Endlose Schrift. So when he began work on the process, apparently he wrote the first chapter and the last chapter together. He said, now I have a beginning and an end. I cannot not finish this novel. And yet, as we know, he was never able to actually finish writing the novel. And we all have just the chapters that are more of in a Brechtian sense, Aufeinander, rather than an Auseinander chapters, you know. So that is, and of course, till the critical edition, I think the sequencing of the chapters also was debatable, because it was done by Max Brod originally, and I think the critical edition has changed a little bit the sequencing of the chapters. So I think that is very much part of Kafka's writing process itself, that the Endlose Schrift. So.
If I may add, respond.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
That yes, we should be very grateful to Max Brod that he saved his works from oblivion. Had he left them in Prague, they would have just vanished. But so it goes to his credit that he, a person who is fleeing, what would one find in his suitcase? One would expect his own things, but he carried works, documents, and manuscripts of Kafka. So that is, I think, a very good example of friendship. And not just the writings, all the diaries and even his drawings, etc. He is managed to save them, and he saved them for several decades, kept them safely, because Israel was also not a very safe country. Or is still not a safe country. So he went out of his way to protect them. So that I have all sympathy. I like this Max Brod.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm very happy the way it has shaped out. And again, thanks Mansi, Amrita, Bjorn, Yuta. So the internal team of Goethe, and of course all the mentors and translators, and Naveen Kishore, of course, and Gita Honega. Naveen agreed that we publish the foreword of one of his Siegel books, The Royal Road, I think, Am Königsweg. Yeah. So there are many more names, and if I have forgotten anyone, I'm eternally grateful to everyone who made this project a success. So if Kafka was around, he would still write about bureaucracy, about the trap that bureaucracy has become for ordinary citizens, what we are experiencing every day, and about justice, about freedom, about human relations. So these are the eternal topics, eternal and timeless motifs. And in that spirit, we will carry on with our understanding, interpretation, reinterpretation of Kafka, and we'll meet again on this platform, in this forum, or on site. And on that note, auf Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen.
Until we meet again.
Vielen Dank.